You could argue pop art's heyday is long gone, but for others, the artistic movement that appealed to many during the 1950s is alive and loved. Andy Warhol is probably the pop artist that comes to mind first. He'd crank out mass-produced pieces and often turn to screen prints, one of his signature styles. Warhol loved to play around with celebrity images, most famously Marilyn Monroe and Elvis. His style developed commercially and became one of the hallmarks of pop art. Images of Campbell's soup cans and Coca-Cola bottles were born from his fascination with industrial production and well-known consumer brands. All that can be seen in a retrospective exhibition of Warhol's life's work. New York's Whitney Museum of American Art is paying homage to the artist by displaying more than 350 of his pieces. Alongside his most famous creations are earlier sketches that show his inclination to capture universal themes like life and death in his art.
Well, I mean, the exhibition is really very formal, so it really walks us through the early work of Warhol when he was a commercial illustrator working in the fashion industry in New York, and then through the pop work, the more revolutionary, paradigm-shifting way of making a painting, but also the work that Warhol was making after the 60s. And often the work that people saw as maybe not as important, not as interesting, was not critically well received. So this exhibition is an attempt to really see the whole as much as one can with any one artist, but it's holistic.
Type up online the definition of pop art and it's often explained as artwork made by objects that can be thrown away. Perhaps that's why many fans see pop art as not only a reflection of our society, but an indispensable part of it as well.
So is pop art still as popular today as it was when it first emerged? To answer that and more, let's speak to art historian John Curley, who has penned a book titled Global Art and the Cold War. Thank you so much for joining us today on Showcase, John. Now, back in the 1950s, there was two different kinds of pop art, one that emerged from the US on American culture and one that emerged in the UK on American culture. What was the difference between the two, or was there any difference?
It's a great question. I mean, I think the origins, you're precisely right to look at the origins in the 1950s in both Britain and the US. And in Britain, you really had artists like Richard Hamilton and Eduardo Palazzi, who were using collage and looking at Life magazine and other American media sources to really investigate them. And what's really interesting about the British context is that you have to think about 1950s in London. It's after World War II. There's many bomb sites still existing within the London urban fabric. There's still rationing until 1954 from World War II. There's still a curfew. There's still traditional class hierarchies in place. And so the British artists looked to American visual culture as an escape from their dreary lives. And so they began to investigate this culture scientifically. And in the 1950s in America, you also had artists like Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg who also used sort of media materials. Their works still looked like, like art. Still they looked handmade. They still had drips. They still had big, bold brushstrokes. And so these are sort of the two origin points for pop art, but really took Andy Warhol and others in the 1960s to kind of bring those ideas to fruition.
So you think that grim feeling back in the UK at that time was one of the reasons why they didn't make pop art about their own culture?
Exactly right. I mean, there's this great story where a British artist named John McHale was at Yale in New Haven, Connecticut, and brought back to London a giant steamer trunk full of Life magazines and other American media materials. And this became a rich, fertile ground for them to make collages, to explore American culture, again, as a way to investigate it sort of critically, but also as a way to, as a bright, colorful escape from their dreary lives. Because British media was also black and white at this time, and American magazines had this, bright color, giant pictures of cars and of like big bright eggs or big bright, pieces of cake. And this sort of visual culture really attracted these British artists.
Mm-hmm. Now, not everyone was a fan of pop art back at that time. We had art historian Cannon Greenberg criticize it, saying it was very superficial. And then later Andy Warhol came out saying he is a very superficial man. Why wasn't it loved by everyone?
It's a great question. I think we really, again, have to go back to the 1950s. And the art that was very popular in America, but also in Western Europe, was, abstraction. So artists like Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko. And if anything, we could describe their works of art in one word, it'd be serious. They were engaged with sort of the tradition of modernism since Picasso, but also they were more engaged with what it means to be a painter in a world after the Holocaust, after the dropping of the atomic bombs. And so what does it mean to be an artist in 1945? And so there's all this existential angst, around painting in the 1950s. And so many critics like Clement Greenberg labeled pop as superficial for precisely these reasons. It seemed frivolous, not engaged with seriousness. So that was one reason. And also, I think, fine art, generally speaking, did not engage the market or sort of consumerism in a direct way. And art was always seen as somehow, above consumerism, above our, mundane realities. And so by pop art engaging sort of the crass consumerism of American life, it also sort of rubbed some critics the wrong way. Art should be important, should be serious, and not about the market.
Mm-hmm. Now, pop art, it really did become a global phenomenon, and artists around the world started pursuing this as their own career as well. Tell me about some of those artists around the world.
Sure. I mean, I think throughout Western Europe, so you have artists in France like Yves Klein and Armand who use sort of everyday objects, especially Armand. But like in Germany, perhaps one of the most famous painters living today, Gerhard Richter, who were trained in East Germany, moved to West Germany right before the Berlin Wall went up. But he started painting, copies of media photographs around 1962. We largely found his voice outside of Warhol and other American pop artists. It kind of emerged at the same time. But beyond Western Europe, I think it's interesting to consider, Latin America and Asia and these other places where pop art emerged. And I think it's a little more complicated because you think about something like Coca-Cola. Their global expansion throughout the 1960s, they began selling their products in Japan in 1964. And so issues of when an artist in Japan references Coca-Cola, not necessarily about celebrating it or things like that, but really trying to explore issues of cultural and economic imperialism. And so instead of sending troops over to foreign lands, America could send its consumer goods, its Coca-Cola and its cars. And so especially in the age of Vietnam, where consumerism is very much tied to American international policy, many foreign artists, were thinking very critically about America and using pop art as a way to, criticize and critique consumerism and American policy. So it's really interesting how, in America, many people see pop art as celebrating mass culture and consumerism. But when those same images go, in a different context, they can become critical of American policies and ideas.
Mm-hmm. But it all does come down to being influenced by American culture, doesn't it?
Yes, you're exactly right. And I think there's this great phrase that comes into being in the 1960s, Coca colonization. So the idea is of the global expansion of American brands, and along with that, the art itself of Warhol, of Roy Lichtenstein, and other American pop artists also becomes very important and influential and shown all over Western Europe. So influence is both from consumer goods, but also the artists themselves.
Well, John, tell me a bit about those American pop art artists in the United States.
Sure. So I guess one of the better known ones is Roy Lichtenstein. And his sort of signature style was to paint large-scale copies of frames from comic books. So instead of having the whole comic narrative, he takes one singular frame and blows it up, 8 to 10 feet wide, and it sort of renders it on canvas. So they're quite striking images. They're quite ambiguous. But again, people label them as frivolous, just mere copies of cartoons.
John, do you think pop art is still a movement today?
I think movement's probably not the right word. I think it's really embedded within the lifeblood of contemporary art. I mean, there are thousands of artists around the world who use media materials, who reference film stars or other kind of mass cultural references in their work, and all of those artists in some ways are descendants of Warhol, and the pop artists. For example, Jeff Koons is perhaps one of the best known artists in the world today. One of his most famous works is a 12-foot high balloon, stainless steel balloon animal. So at children's birthday parties, clowns will shape balloons into animals, and he made a monumentally scaled version of one of these balloon animals. So it's frivolous, but also it's monumental. So very much in line with Warhol's elevation of a Campbell soup can, something monumental.
All right, John Curley, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise on pop art with us.
Thank you so much, and have a great day.